The Great Pyramid in Egypt sits directly above a web of underground cracks that scientists only confirmed with modern equipment. The Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, built with stones so heavy that no crane in the ancient world could have lifted them, sits above a fault line that runs the full length of the Bekaa Valley. The Parthenon in Greece is anchored into a rock shelf, sitting directly on top of one of the most earthquake-prone fault zones in all of Europe. 3 buildings, 3 separate civilizations, 3 completely different points in history, and every single one of them built directly above the deepest fault lines on Earth. Hold that. Just hold it. Here is the thing about written records. They can be mistranslated. Dating results can be questioned. One researcher's reading of an ancient text is another researcher's error, but the ground underneath these structures cannot be argued with. What seismic surveys, ground-penetrating radar, and foundation core samples show does not depend on anyone's opinion. It depends on coordinates, exact locations on a map, and when you take those coordinates and lay them over a map of the world's major fault lines, something remarkable happens. What should look like random scatter becomes a pattern so clear and so consistent that it needs a name. We do not have one yet. These are not simply large buildings. Large buildings have been built throughout history, and their construction is well understood. The structures we are looking at belong to a different category entirely. They share 3 qualities that push well beyond what the ancient world, as we currently understand it, should have been able to produce. And the third quality, the one that almost no one discusses, is their relationship to the ground directly beneath them. That is where this begins. Before we name a single site, we need to understand the category we are dealing with. Because the mistake most people make, including many researchers who should know better, is treating these structures as simply very impressive old buildings. They are not. Calling them large is like calling the ocean wet. Technically true, completely missing the point. So let us be precise about what makes this category different. There are 3 things, and all 3 of them need to be present together before a structure earns a place in this conversation. The first is scale, not impressive scale, not wow, that is big scale. Scale that has no explanation in the known construction record of its time. We are talking about buildings whose size, weight, and complexity exceed every verified construction program from the same era. Not by a small margin, but by a margin that engineers today, with cranes and computers and reinforced steel, look at and pause. There is a reason modern construction companies have been asked to study some of these sites and have come back with answers like, "We are not sure how we would do this today." That kind of scale. The second is construction quality. This is where it gets even harder to dismiss. The precision of the stonework in this category of structure, the way individual blocks are cut, the way they fit together, the way weight is distributed across a foundation, has been reviewed by professional engineers and structural specialists in peer-reviewed settings. Their conclusion, stated carefully and with the appropriate academic caution, is that replicating this quality today would be extraordinarily expensive and, in some specific cases, is not something our current methods could achieve cleanly. The joints in some of these structures are tighter than the width of a human hair, not in 1 or 2 places, consistently, across tons of stone. Those 2 qualities alone would make these buildings worth studying. But they are not what brought us here. The third quality is the one that sits quietly in the background of almost every serious geological survey done at these sites. It is almost never the headline. It rarely makes it into the summary. But it is there, in the technical data, waiting to be read by anyone patient enough to look. The foundations of these structures do not simply rest on solid ground the way a sensible builder would choose a flat, stable surface. In case after case, when geologists and structural engineers have mapped the foundation plans against the subsurface geology beneath them, a pattern appears. The structures are oriented, aligned, or anchored in direct response to what is happening in the rock below them, not beside the geological feature, not near it, on it, above it. engaged with it in a way that suggests whoever chose these sites knew exactly what was underneath before a single stone was placed. That is not something you do by accident. That is not something you do without knowledge. And that third quality is what the next several sections are about. Now, before we go any further, we need to do something important. We need to give the mainstream explanation a fair hearing, because the argument that these structures were built above fault lines is not new, and the people who study these sites professionally have a ready response to it. It is a reasonable response, and we are going to take it seriously, because that is the only honest way to show you exactly where it breaks down. The standard explanation is called survivorship bias. The idea is straightforward. Of all the large structures built in the ancient world, most have crumbled, been buried, or disappeared entirely. The ones that survived are the ones that were built well, and buildings that were built well tended to be built on solid, stable ground. Solid, stable ground tends to be bedrock, and bedrock, in many parts of the world, happens to sit near fault lines. So the argument goes like this: we are not seeing a deliberate pattern. We are seeing the natural result of good builders choosing good ground, and good ground happening to correlate with the geology we are now mapping. As an explanation, this is clean, it is logical, it does not require anything unusual, and for any single site taken on its own, it is technically available. You cannot rule it out for one building in one location. That is fair, and it deserves to be said plainly. But here is where it stops working. Think of it this way. Imagine you are told that a marksman hit the bullseye on a target. You might say, reasonable enough, that he got lucky. Bullseyes happen by chance sometimes. Now imagine he hit the bullseye on 5 targets in a row in 5 different countries using 5 different weapons he had never fired before. At some point, luck stops being the explanation. Precision becomes the only word that fits. The survivorship bias argument predicts that ancient builders chose the stable ground near a fault, the ground beside the fracture, not the fracture itself. Stable rock, not the seam where tectonic plates meet and grind. That is what a cautious, practical builder does. You do not build your most important structure on the most geologically active point in the landscape. You build next to it, where the ground is firm. But that is not what the data shows. When structural engineers and geologists have overlaid the precise foundation plans of these structures against detailed subsurface fault mapping, not rough regional maps, but specific fracture line data, the alignment is not to the stable ground beside the fault, it is to the fault itself, the deep fracture, the exact point of maximum geological activity, not minimum. That is not survivorship bias. That is the opposite of survivorship bias. A builder avoiding geological instability builds beside the fracture. Whatever built these structures built on top of it, deliberately, repeatedly, across thousands of miles and thousands of years. That difference matters, and it does not have a tidy explanation. There is a category of evidence that does not come from ancient texts or disputed translations or contested dating methods. It comes from a drill. A core sample drill pushed slowly into the earth beneath a structure, pulling up a cylinder of soil and rock that tells you, layer by layer, exactly what happened in that ground over thousands of years. You do not interpret a core sample the way you interpret a hieroglyph. You read it the way you read a receipt. It is a physical record of events, stacked in the order they occurred. And what the core samples taken beneath several of these structures show is something that the restoration reports note briefly, sometimes in a single paragraph, sometimes in a footnote, and that the broader archaeology literature almost never places side by side with the samples from other sites. Here is what they show. Beneath the foundations, the soil does not transition the way undisturbed ground does. Undisturbed ground has a signature. Centuries of gradual accumulation produce layers that are relatively even, relatively predictable, relatively boring in the way that slow natural processes are boring. What you find beneath these structures is not that. below the foundation level, and in some cases below additional foundation layers that suggest the visible structure was built on top of an even older construction phase. The soil composition changes sharply. The material is consistent with what geologists call high-energy deposition. That is the technical phrase, and it is worth understanding what it means in plain language. High-energy deposition is what happens when something powerful moves a large amount of material in a short amount of time. Floodwater carrying sediment, an atmospheric event pushing particulate matter into the ground under pressure. The kind of force that does not build up slowly over centuries but arrives, does its work, and leaves a mark that is readable 10,000 years later. Think of it like the difference between dust settling on a shelf over a year and a wave washing over a beach in 30 seconds. The shelf dust looks even and fine. The wave deposit looks compressed, mixed, and distinct from whatever was underneath it. Geologists who have reviewed these samples have used the phrase event horizon deposit, meaning a layer that marks a specific event rather than a gradual process. Something happened, something powerful, and it deposited that material before the structures above it were built. That is not a fringe interpretation. That is what the physical record in the ground says when you read it without deciding in advance what it should say. The structures were built on top of that deposit, which means whoever built them arrived after the event. They found ground that had already been marked by something large and fast and powerful. And they chose that ground, that specific, geologically active, event-marked ground, to build the most ambitious structures of their age. That choice was not random. Random does not produce a consistent signature across multiple continents. Something guided it. Up to this point, a careful skeptic could still be holding a reasonable objection. One site with unusual stratigraphy is an anomaly. Two sites with the same signature could be coincidence. The local geology argument still has room to breathe when we are talking about one or two locations in the same part of the world. Local conditions, local building traditions, local rock formations. These are real variables and they deserve real consideration. So let us remove that option entirely. Giza Plateau, Egypt. A structure so precisely built that when modern surveyors measured its base in the 19th century, they found it level to within a fraction of an inch across an area the size of 9 city blocks. Sitting directly above a documented network of subsurface fault lines confirmed by seismic survey. Teotihuacan, Mexico. A city of pyramids built by a civilization we still cannot fully identify, whose construction methods remain genuinely unexplained, positioned above a fault system in the Valley of Mexico that geologists have mapped in detail. Göbekli Tepe, Turkey. Currently the oldest known monumental structure on Earth, pushing our understanding of organized human construction back by thousands of years, carved into a limestone ridge that sits directly above one of the most complex fault networks in the Middle East. Puma Punku, Bolivia. Stone blocks cut with a precision that stonecutters today find difficult to explain, placed at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters above a tectonic boundary that runs the length of the Andes. The megalithic temples of Malta. The oldest freestanding stone structures on the planet, built on a small island in the Mediterranean that sits on a fault line running beneath the seafloor in one of Europe's most seismically active zones. 5 sites, 5 continents, 5 completely separate cultures with no documented contact in the conventional historical record, no shared language, no shared trade route that archaeology has confirmed, no mechanism by which knowledge of building practices could have traveled between them in the time periods involved. And yet, the same 2 things are true of all of them. They sit above fault lines. And where foundation core data exists, the same high-energy deposit signature appears in the ground beneath them. At this point, the local explanation is simply not available. Locality requires proximity. It requires a shared source, a common teacher, a connected culture, a trade network, a migration route. None of those exist between these 5 locations in the relevant time periods. The conventional historical timeline does not give us a mechanism for this level of consistency across this much distance. What we are left with is a pattern that behaves the way global patterns behave, the way ocean currents behave, the way atmospheric systems behave, the way any phenomenon behaves when its cause is not local but planetary. The variable these 5 sites share is not culture. It is not language. It is not time period. It is the ground beneath them. And the question that ground is asking has not been answered yet. Every great civilization leaves a paper trail. That is one of the things that makes a civilization great. The ability to organize, record, and pass on information. The Egyptians were extraordinary record keepers. They documented tax collection, grain storage, medical procedures, legal disputes, and religious ceremonies in remarkable detail. The Romans tracked military movements, building projects, supply chains, and labor costs with the precision of a modern accounting department. These were not primitive societies guessing their way through history. They were sophisticated administrative machines that wrote things down, which is exactly why the gaps in the construction records for these specific structures are so difficult to explain away. Take Giza. Egyptian administrative papyri, actual physical documents that have survived thousands of years, do record activity at the site. Workforce rotations are mentioned. Tool inventories exist. Grain rations for workers have been calculated. Researchers have used these documents to build a picture of how the pyramids were constructed, and that picture is presented confidently in textbooks and documentaries as a solved problem. But when industrial engineers, people who build large things for a living and understand exactly what large-scale construction requires, have sat down with those numbers and done the mathematics, the results do not hold. The workforce figures in the papyri, combined with the most generous possible assumptions about daily productivity, do not account for the volume of stone moved, cut, and placed in the time the historical record allows. To make the numbers work, you have to assume levels of sustained productivity that have no parallel in any other documented construction project in human history. Not similar projects, any project. That is not a small problem. That is the mathematics refusing to cooperate. Now move to Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon. The Romans built an extraordinary temple complex there, the Temple of Jupiter, and their construction records for it are detailed and largely intact. Engineers, columns, supply routes, workforce numbers. The Romans knew how to build, and they knew how to document building. But beneath the Roman temple, there are 3 foundation stones that the Roman records do not mention. Not because the records are incomplete, because the Romans did not put them there. Each of those 3 stones weighs more than 800 tons. For context, the largest crane operating in the world today can lift around 3,000 tons under ideal conditions. And those conditions require careful preparation, specialized equipment, and a team of engineers. The Romans had none of that. The largest stones they are documented to have moved weighed a fraction of 800 tons. The Romans built their temple on top of those foundation stones the way you might build a house on top of a boulder. The boulder was already there. You use it because it is solid and it suits your purpose. You do not record moving it because you did not move it. Someone else put those stones there. The Roman records are silent on who. Not because the Romans were hiding something, because they genuinely did not know. That silence is the most honest thing in the entire record. Here is something worth understanding about how history gets written. Not as a criticism, as a description. Because the process is not dishonest. It is not a conspiracy. It is something far more ordinary and far more difficult to correct. It is a habit of mind that feels like common sense right up until the moment you realize what it has been quietly erasing. When historians and archaeologists encounter a structure they cannot fully explain, they do not leave a blank space in the record. Blank spaces are uncomfortable. They invite speculation. They make textbooks harder to write and museum placards harder to word. So instead of a blank space, the structure gets attributed to the nearest known builder, the civilization that was present at the site, the culture whose fingerprints are visible on the upper layers, the people who were clearly there. even if clearly there and clearly built it are two very different things. Call it narrative absorption. The anomaly does not disappear. It gets absorbed into an existing story until it is no longer visible as an anomaly at all. Watch how it works in practice. The megalithic foundation platform at Baalbek is attributed to Roman construction because the Romans built a magnificent temple on top of it. The Romans were indisputably present. The Romans were indisputably great builders. Therefore, the foundation beneath their temple is recorded as Roman, despite the fact that the stones in that foundation are 3 times heavier than anything the Romans are documented to have moved anywhere else in their entire empire. The precision stonework at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, walls of interlocking stone so tightly fitted that a piece of paper cannot be slid between the blocks, is attributed to the Inca because the Inca were living there when Spanish conquistadors arrived and incorporated the site into their own buildings. The Inca were present. The Inca were skilled. Therefore, the stonework is Incan. Despite the fact that Incan construction elsewhere looks measurably different, and the Inca themselves, in oral traditions recorded by early Spanish chroniclers, referred to the oldest parts of the site as the work of a people who came before them. The deepest layers at Göbekli Tepe are attributed to Neolithic foragers because Neolithic foragers are the population that dating places at the site. They were there, therefore they built it. Despite the fact that everything we know about Neolithic forager societies suggests they did not organize the kind of sustained, large-scale, precision construction that the deepest courses at Göbekli Tepe required. The pattern is identical in every case. Find the nearest known builder, assign the structure, move forward, and here is the consequence that matters most. Once the attribution is made, the anomalous layer, the deepest foundation, the heaviest stone, the stratigraphy that does not fit the assigned builder's known capabilities, stops being investigated as a mystery. It has been explained. The file is closed. The gap does not disappear. It just gets a name that does not belong to it. And then nobody looks anymore. When you have established a pattern across multiple sites on multiple continents, the next honest question is a simple one. When? When did whatever produced this pattern actually happen? And when you begin pressing the physical evidence for an answer, something unexpected emerges. Not a clean date, because the tools we use for dating ancient material have margins of error wide enough to drive a century through, but something more useful than a clean date, a cluster. The deepest datable layers beneath these structures do not spread evenly across all of human history the way random events would. They group, not perfectly. The dating methods are genuinely imprecise, and researchers who work with them are careful to say so. But the grouping is present, and it has been noted, not loudly, not in the headline findings of major archaeological papers, but in the geological literature. In the reports written by the scientists studying the soil and the rock rather than the structures above them, the clustering is mentioned, carefully, briefly, and almost never in the same breath as the clustering noted at other sites thousands of miles away. Here is what the material itself shows in the cases where detailed analysis has been done. The event horizon deposit, that compressed, high-energy layer sitting beneath the foundations, carries what geologists call isotopic signatures. Think of an isotopic signature as a chemical fingerprint left behind by a specific type of event. Different events leave different fingerprints. A slow flood leaves one kind. A volcanic eruption leaves another. A large, fast, high-energy surface event, the kind that moves enormous amounts of material across a wide area in a very short time, leaves its own distinct mark in the compaction ratios and the chemical composition of the deposit. The signatures in several of these samples have been associated by geologists working on entirely separate projects in entirely separate locations with that third category, a high-energy surface event, something large, something fast, something that covered a significant portion of the Earth's surface in a period of time that geological processes would measure not in centuries, but in days or weeks. Now hold that finding next to what the historical record describes in a specific and well-documented period of human history. A period marked by the sudden collapse of dynasties that had been stable for generations. Crop failures spreading across continents simultaneously with no single drought or disease to explain them. Cities abandoned without evidence of military conquest. No burned gates, no mass graves, no signs of invasion. Just absence. People who were there and then were not. You already know the decade this points toward. We have discussed it before in a different context. The same window that appeared in the cartographic record, in the architectural record, in the disappearance of a political entity from 2 centuries of European maps. The physical record beneath these foundations is pointing at that same window, but pointing at it from underneath, from below the ground, from a layer deposited before the structures above it were ever built. The geological record and the historical record are looking at each other across thousands of years, and they are describing the same moment. Let us be honest about what we have and what we do not have, because this is the point where intellectual honesty matters most, where the temptation to reach further than the evidence allows is strongest, and where resisting that temptation is the only thing that keeps this investigation worth taking seriously. Here is what the evidence actually demonstrates. There is a global distribution of anomalous structures whose scale and construction quality exceed what the documented builders of their era are known to have been capable of. That is not an opinion. That is the conclusion of engineers and geologists who have reviewed the physical evidence without an agenda attached to the outcome. These structures were cited with a specificity, fault exact, not merely fault adjacent. That coincidence does not explain when the pattern repeats across 5 continents with no documented connection between the cultures involved. Beneath them, the ground carries a stratigraphic signature consistent with a high-energy event that preceded the construction above it, and the mechanism by which all of this has remained largely invisible in the mainstream record is not suppression or conspiracy. It is something quieter and more persistent. The habit of attributing the unexplained layer to the nearest known name, closing the file, and moving forward. That is what the evidence demonstrates. All of it is documentable. All of it is traceable to physical records, engineering reviews, geological surveys, and administrative archives that are publicly available to anyone with the patience to find them and read them carefully. Now here is what the evidence does not demonstrate. It does not tell us who made the decision to build on these fault lines. It does not tell us what kind of knowledge system would need to exist for a group of people, or multiple groups of people across different continents, to identify the deepest fault lines on Earth and choose them deliberately as construction sites. It does not tell us what the relationship between the geology below and the structures above actually was, what purpose that relationship served, what understanding of the Earth's interior it reflected. Those questions are open. They are open not because the evidence is too thin to matter, but because the evidence that would answer them is the evidence that keeps being filed under someone else's name. The foundation layer keeps becoming Roman. The deepest course keeps becoming Incan. The oldest stratigraphy keeps becoming Neolithic. And every time that happens, the question those layers are asking gets one more layer of attribution piled on top of it. Something knew where the fault lines were. Something made a decision. Repeatedly, globally, across distances that the conventional historical timeline gives us no mechanism to connect, to build directly above them, not beside them, on them. That is what the foundations say when you read them without deciding in advance what they are allowed to mean. The question is not whether this pattern exists. At this point, the pattern is the clearest thing in the entire investigation. The question is, what kind of knowledge produces a pattern that consistent, that precise, and that perfectly erased? We do not have that answer yet. But now you know exactly where to look.